The founders believed that every individual needed to have economic liberty in order to participate in a representative republic. Do we have enough ownership to protect democracy? No, I don't think we do. The working middle class is hurting. We've had inflation of 1 to 8% and a wage growth of 1 to 3%. And that ends up becoming reduced real wages. Workers are going to need an opportunity to have a share of equity ownership or of profits in order to build their wealth. And this is happening while they are under enormous pressure for increased healthcare costs and where they are being asked to shoulder virtually all of the expenses for their own retirement plans.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. What did the drafters of the U.S. Constitution, 19th century industrialists, and a modern defense contractor have in common? In this episode, economic sociologist Joseph Blasi explains that they all believed in one powerful idea, that democracy itself depends on ownership, and that ownership should therefore be broadly shared. Joe is a distinguished professor at the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University. He has spent a career studying the economic sociology of corporations, corporate governance, and the sociology of work. He is one of the world's leading researchers on employee ownership, and in his book, The Citizen's Share, he argues that to build work that truly works for humans, we need to think not just about the surface questions like job design, but about who actually owns the value that work creates. In this episode, Joe and I explore how America's founding vision was rooted in broad-based property ownership, how 18th century cod fishing crews pioneered profit sharing, how Dr. J. Robert Beister built an $8 billion defense contracting company entirely owned by its employees, and what all of this means for how we structure our companies, how we run them as founders and leaders, how we distribute wealth, and how we preserve democracy today. All right, if you enjoy this episode, as always, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, here's my conversation with Joseph Blasi. Joseph Blasi, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
On this show, we are all about the design of work and the design of work experience. And one of the threads that we're following up on is how deeply do we need to dig into the operating system of how companies run before we can create an environment in which great work design can thrive. And so one of the threads that we've been exploring kind of on and off, sometimes it's just mentioned in one of the earlier shows, or sometimes we dive deeper, but I think this is going to be the deepest dive yet into employee ownership in various forms. And so what I want to go through in particular is your book, The Citizen's Share. And the subtitle is Putting Ownership Back into Democracy. And every single word in that title is important. I want to start just by laying the foundation. What is broad-based capitalism?
Broad-based capitalism means that every citizen has sufficient ownership to support themselves. That's the shortest and most elegant answer to what broad-based capitalism means. We know what feudalism was. Feudalism was concentration of wealth by nobles, by property classes under a king or sovereign. And capitalism meant that individuals could be rewarded for their own individual effort, and that status was no longer the main determinant of income and wealth. And broad-based capitalism takes that approach. Status is no longer the main determinant of income and wealth. You can be rewarded for your performance in work, and applies it to all citizens.
What's the relationship between the term broad-based capitalism and things like profit sharing or employee stock ownership Are they the same thing, or is the second bit a subset?
Profit sharing and employee ownership are two sides of the same coin. That coin is having a share of the performance in the company where you work. We'll put off to the side for the moment the experience of citizens who do not work in a workplace, such as children, pensioners, and others. But let's go back to that coin, the coin called shares in the workplace. Profit sharing is a share in the current profits of the company in any quarter or any year. And employee share ownership, employee stock ownership, is a share in the equity ownership of that company. And we know that equity is the value of the company when you take into account its profits. And we know that profit sharing is the immediate income of a company. And that's why they're two sides of the same coin.
Oftentimes, when you hear the phrases that are related to employee ownership, at first blush, it sounds anti-capitalist. In other words, it sounds like it's something that might be more socialist, or it might be interested in eliminating private property or something like that. But you specifically say capitalism. And so I just want to clear up front that this is embedded into a capitalist approach.
Absolutely. This is embedded into a capitalist approach. Some people love and like, some people don't prefer the word capitalism, but capitalism is about private ownership, which employee ownership is about. Capitalism is about value connected to a market, which employee ownership is about. Capitalism is about rewards for individual performance, which employee ownership is all about. And the broad-based nature of employee ownership and profit sharing is capitalism for everybody.
And one of the things that really surprised me in your book was how old the idea is of employee ownership and its relationship to democracy. So there's a whole chapter about what the founders of the United States thought was necessary for a republic, and that ownership was part of what they felt was necessary for a republic. What was the history? You started off talking about cod fishermen, but then you went on to talk about shareholders, well, farmers. What is that history, and who of the founders was passionate about it?
The founders, as a group, were reacting against British and European feudalism. They were acting against the British and the European economy, where individuals didn't have a chance at ownership, didn't control their own property. And that's the first and most important part of this history. The founders believed that every individual needed to have economic liberty in order to participate in a representative republic. And their thinking was that if you didn't have enough property to support yourself, then you didn't have individual liberty, then your vote, your participation could be manipulated by a tyrant or by powerful, rich forces in society. And so that's how they connected a democratic republic to broad-based holding of property. It's true that they also believed that a more egalitarian holding of property, not equal holding of property, but a more egalitarian holding of private property was also necessary for a republic to exist. But they specifically did not believe in socialism or communism, none of them. And I'm happy to say that chapter 1 of the Citizen Share was my favorite chapter to write, because I literally sat down and read all of the original writings of the founders of the American Republic.
On Work for Humans, we've been exploring the principles of multi-sided management, which is the belief that work is a product that every company designs, builds, and delivers to employees. Along the way, people started asking how they could put these ideas into practice. So I founded the work design firm 11fold to help your company create the kind of work that makes teams feel alive and engaged instead of dead and dull. So you can reduce turnover and build commitment. We're doing something revolutionary here. Learn more at 11fold.com. That's 11fold.com. I was going to ask how on earth you research something like that, because you were digging into early drafts of constitutions of states. I mean, the volume must be enormous, and finding references to what they thought about the relationship between employee ownership, well, citizen ownership, I should say. It doesn't have to be employee ownership, but citizen ownership in the Republic.
It was largely employee ownership because their vision of the new American Republic, their anti-feudalism vision, was that you would have self-employed farmers, that agriculture would be most of the economy, and farming at that time, in that sense, is employee ownership, is worker ownership, and that you would have independent craftspeople who would own their tools, own their businesses, and derive full profit sharing from all of their work. They didn't have the term employee ownership, but the way they conceived of this new economy is very consistent with the notion that those who work would retain ownership of their work and of the proceeds of their work.
Now, at the time, when it came to land, it seems to me that this did not require any redistribution of wealth, which they didn't count Native Americans. But it was essentially settling of land that had not been settled by Europeans, distributing that land, and giving people ownership of it. And you can correct me if that's wrong. But in the case of the cod fishing industry, there were owners of the boats, and they wanted to up the cod fishing yield. And so in that case, it seems like the sharing of profit was somewhat redistributive. The question I want to ask is, how do you square the Founding Fathers' fairly progressive ideas around this with the fact that many of them were slave owners?
Yes, let me talk about both. In my discussion of the Founding Fathers, I tend to focus on those who were not slave owners, who imagined an alternative to European and English feudalism and broad-based property ownership being part of a republic. But there's no way around it that a number of the Founding Fathers who were slave owners, like Jefferson and Madison, for example, also wrote very intently about the importance of broad-based property ownership. And it's just the contradiction. The same as the contradiction that they were writing about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and they were thinking of the vote only for white men, and that they were wanting to perpetuate slavery. Thank God our nation evolved beyond that. But there's no way to get around the hypocrisy and the imperfection. And let's just state it just because it's important to state, and I did in my first chapter, the evil of slavery and the dark shadow that the evil of slavery casts on any discussion where it's part of the story.
And who was William Findley? I had not really heard about him before reading your book.
William Findley, who's not well known, he was a supporter of the American Revolution in Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia. And the reason why he comes up in the story of the book in chapter 1 is that we didn't have corporations in the young United States. And the first debate about whether to have a law to allow corporations happened in the Pennsylvania legislature. And it was William Findley who argued so strongly that he was afraid that corporations would concentrate wealth and recreate the concentration of wealth under feudalism that the founders were trying to get away from in England and feudalistic Europe. Now, how did he come into my story? It ends up that when this debate took place in the legislature of Pennsylvania, and Ben Franklin was the governor then of the legislature of Pennsylvania, and he was running the discussion, as it were, that someone was writing down the minutes of the entire discussion. And when you go back and actually read that book of those minutes, William Findley, in my opinion, was the most eloquent defender of this argument that we did this to reduce wealth inequality and we don't want corporations to recreate it.
And I think you mentioned along the way that he was very anti-slavery.
He was very anti-slavery, yes. And what I try to do is I try to talk about all of the founders and their writings. But in my chapter 1, I emphasize the fact that the idea of broad-based property ownership was held very dearly by the founders who were anti-slavery. And John Adams plays an important role in this discussion. The overall vision of the founders to get to broad-based property ownership was to use land. And there's no way around it. They saw the land in the new American continent as not being owned by anybody. And that was false. Obviously, Native Americans held and owned most of the land, if not all of the land. And I'll come to this in a minute, but their notion was that by making it easy for individual citizens, and at the time they meant men, for individual citizens to have ownership of land was their approach to broad-based ownership. And they tried to do that in every possible way. They set up a situation where different colonies would award what they saw as public land to individual citizens. In some cases, as time went on, made it easy for people to accumulate land cheaply. So the vehicle for broad-based capitalism, broad-based property ownership in their mind was land. But you are correct. They very, very quickly, in George Washington's administration as president, came up with an idea that applied broad-based ownership and profit sharing to an actual business that was not land. And that was the cod fishery. Cod fishing for hundreds of years on the American continent had broad-based profit sharing. And when George Washington became president, the British had completely destroyed the cod fishery, which was one of the largest export markets of the new country. And so he signed into law one of the first economic acts of the Washington administration, saying that the bigger the ship that went out to rebuild the cod industry, there would be essentially something like tax credits paid to the owner of the ship, but that the owner of the ships could only get these tax advantages if there was broad-based profit sharing on the catch. Separately, I found in my research in New England that in many cases, there were also ownership shares in these ships. In fact, sailors sometimes traded these ownership shares. So the cod fishery is really one of the first examples of broad-based employee share ownership and profit sharing in American history. And you can go into the National Archives and see all of the evidence of this. It's quite remarkable.
It's very interesting. It sounds like their objective was, if on balance, not about creating great lives for the people who are in the republic as workers, but rather a republic that would survive. A very national perspective on why they were doing this.
Absolutely. Now, it's important to note that from their perspective, there would be enough land to do this, both because of the way they conceived of business is all about agriculture and mostly about agriculture and land. As they say, with the exception of shipping, where with the cod fishery, they came up with the form of shares. But that quickly changed, right? President Madison, early in the 1800s, he decided to sit down and estimate whether you could have enough broad-based land ownership to save the republic, to sustain the republic. And really, on the back of an envelope, Madison projected the amount of land that the United States would have in 100 years from the early 1800s and the population. And he divided one into the other, and he quickly saw that there wouldn't be enough land per citizen for a landed republic, what Jefferson wrote about as an agrarian republic of landowners. And so he said that that was the biggest public policy problem. Somehow the government had to come up with an answer. And in chapter 1 of the book, I present the answer because the Speaker of the House of Representatives under President Abraham Lincoln, his name was Galusha Grow, and he's often called the father of the Republican Party. And he at the time said that it would be possible to achieve this broad-based ownership and profit sharing by using shares in corporations. Because as he said, shares in corporations were unlimited and corporate ownership was unlimited. And you didn't have to be dependent on land. And so for me, the whole second half of the book is inspired by Speaker of the House of Representatives, Republican Galusha Grow, who saw shares in corporations being able to carry the ideal of many of the founders to extend ownership of property to all persons.
Very, very interesting. First of all, it makes me realize that things like the Louisiana Purchase and the drive westward were in part trying to balance the equation of number of possible landowners with amount of land. And then that's a really enormous innovation of Galusha Grow to start thinking about shares of corporations. And that must have been about 1860 if it was Abraham Lincoln. And one of the things that next really surprised me in the book was the way in the late 1800s, titans of industry, I mean, big names, people who I think of as cigar smoking moguls, were actually talking about employee ownership. And so Carnegie, Pillsbury, Gamble started experimenting with this.
Yes, this is unappreciated. I won't say unknown. It's an unappreciated part of American history, and it's the subject of chapter 4 of The Citizen's Share. In fact, many of these people have been called the robber barons by some historians. I actually don't use that term. And it's interesting because when you read the writings of some of them, they were aware of the founders' views on broad-based property ownership being necessary for a republic and a democracy to exist. And they were trying to come up with ways that large corporations could provide shares to workers to attain that ideal. Andrew Carnegie was specifically aware of the broad-based capitalism approach of many of the founders, and he wrote about it. And people like Pillsbury, people like George Eastman of Kodak, William Cooper Proctor, the grandson of the founder Procter and Gamble, they were very well aware of Christian ideas of the social gospel that talked about employee share ownership and profit sharing as the solution to the wealth inequality of the country at that time.
I want to say something. I had to look up social gospel. I had never heard of social gospel. And I just want to say what I learned about it. Social gospel movement, 1890 about-ish to about 1920, with a focus on social justice, improving society, combating social evils. So among the social evils was poverty, child labor, poor working conditions, and other social ills. And so was this a very widespread movement at that time?
Yes, the social gospel was a very widespread movement among Christian churches. And in fact, at the time, several Christian newspapers were the main national newspapers and magazines in the United States. And the social gospel was written about in these magazines. You'll find some of the famous Christian magazines and newspapers at the time, you'll find side by side advertisements for Ivory soap, the main product of Procter and Gamble, alongside articles by Christian ministers saying that profit sharing and employee share ownership was the only solution to the inequality that industrial capitalism was creating.
Were unions already on the rise at the beginning of the social gospel movement? One of the things I can't quite tell is how many of the ideas of these industrialists were driven by union unrest versus this is the right thing to do for our nation and for the people.
Certainly, union unrest was central. Union unrest became really common after the Civil War, and all of these individuals were against national trade unions organizing their companies. So there's no way to get away from that. Carnegie, Rockefeller, William Cooper Proctor, Pillsbury, they didn't want unions to organize their companies. They had a view that they could organize their companies in a way that they wouldn't require unions. And we simply have to credit that that was part of the history, whether one likes it or not, or agrees with it or not. But it's important to put that under the microscope because people like William Cooper Proctor of Procter and Gamble and Pillsbury and others, they really made an attempt to change the corporate culture of their companies in spite of their attitudes not preferring unions. Now, later on, even to the present time, unions would figure out a way to make peace with both profit sharing and employee share ownership, but that's another story.
We'll get to that. I think we'll get to that. So, to some extent, a part of this is a history of figuring out how to get it done. In other words, we have the idea that employee ownership has some real benefits. And in fact, Carnegie, Pillsbury, and others were saying, look, my company's going to run better if everybody has a part of it. If everybody's interests are aligned with the interests of the company, everything's going to run better. But it seems like a lot of them were very experimental and they didn't know how to do it. And jumping forward pretty far in the story, I want to talk about SAIC and Beister, in particular because you're the J. Robert Beister professor at Rutgers, so you probably know something about that history. It wasn't really called out in the book. But what was Beister trying to do? And I also have a personal interest. I grew up down the street from the Beisters, and so
okay.
I'm very interested in what he was doing.
So Dr. J. Robert Beister, called Bob Beister by those who knew him well, or Dr. B, he was a nuclear physicist, and he worked for General Atomic. He didn't like the way he was treated as an employee. He believed that professionals in these knowledge companies should be treated differently, should have a share of profits and a share of ownership. And then he built Science Applications International Corporation, called then SAIC, to be one of the largest engineering consulting companies working on national problems in the country, with 100% employee ownership and significant shares by workers at all levels of salary. And yes, he endowed the professorship, the endowed chair that I hold at Rutgers, and was a great inspiration to me early in my career when I studied him and his company.
In preparation for this, I read his book, and I was very impressed by the combination of practicality and moral rigor in what he wanted to do. And so he said he wanted to create conditions under which talented people do their best work. And he said, none of us is as smart as all of us. And so a part of what he was working to do was to create agency among the people who worked inside SAIC. And this is one of the things I bring up, that sometimes if you hear about these things, you think, well, those are co-ops that make granola or something like that.
Right.
SAIC was a defense contractor. It was a $8 billion company, is still. I mean, it's an enormous company. And it was tied for him very much with patriotism, which is that he felt that working for the government in the roles that he did was a patriotic act. And so there's this kind of moral rigor throughout everything that he did.
Yes, yes. He was very inspired by the notion of social and economic justice. I found that out when I interviewed him multiple times. But you were right. His company had highly trained individuals, many of them with doctorates, working in defense, working in healthcare, working in various other industries. And they showed that really advanced knowledge workers in a variety of industries, telecom, for example, could have broad-based employee ownership and profit sharing very successfully.
I think he started in the 60s. So it predates all of the Silicon Valley companies. So along comes ERISA. And the thing about SAIC, again, Beister didn't have a lot of pre-existing infrastructure with which to design a company like that. They had to invent a lot of it, is the impression I got. But along comes ERISA and Leo Kelso. What was ERISA?
Let me preface my answer by saying that you're in the middle 1800s. After the Civil War, you have the rise of large corporations. You have people like Carnegie and George Eastman of Kodak and William Cooper Proctor of Procter and Gamble and Pillsbury, all trying to figure out mechanisms of profit sharing and employee share ownership. But their idea at the time was that they would somehow persuade individual CEOs to do this. And Dr. Beister is an example of a CEO who said, okay, I'm going to tell my lawyers and investment bankers to design mechanisms for employee ownership and profit sharing. So now we get to your question, what is ERISA? The bottom line is that all these mechanisms of employee share ownership and profit sharing that were invented and experimented with by many of these industrial titans, they didn't take root in the United States economy. What happened was that the forms of employee share ownership and profit sharing that took root were the forms that were tied to tax incentives. So early in the 1920s, after we got the individual income tax and the corporate income tax, companies that were doing broad-based employee share ownership went to the government and said, could we have deductions, tax deductions, when we do broad-based employee ownership? And they attained that. And then under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, there was a piece of regulation that he and the Republicans worked on to provide tax incentives for deferred profit sharing plans. And they grew enormously after they got those tax incentives. So here I come to answering your question. ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, was the big 1974 legislation on all retirement plans. And it gave companies tax incentives to set up retirement plans. And it made the employee stock ownership plan one of the retirement plans that got tax incentives. And so really, we can trace the big growth of employee ownership in terms of ESOPs to ERISA, because different than what many of these industrial titans thought, that people would do this, corporate leaders would do this just because they thought it was a good idea. Finally, ERISA says you're going to get tax benefits from the US government for doing employee share ownership. And then it expanded quite significantly.
What are those tax advantages?
Well, we could talk right now about the tax advantages for ESOPs.
ESOPs, yeah. Let's talk about ESOPs in particular.
So ESOPs, employee stock ownership plan. If a company sets up an employee stock ownership plan, it gets to deduct from its corporate income on which its corporate tax is based any cash contributions or contributions in shares to create that employee share ownership. If a company finances its ESOP with credit, with loans from a bank or some other lending institution, it gets to deduct from its corporate income for tax purposes the principal payments and the interest payments it pays on that loan. So they're really very, very significant tax incentives. And when you read, just to connect the dots, when you read Senator Russell Long, chairman of the Finance Committee, who put ESOPs into ERISA, when you read his speeches, he's talking about the history that we just got finished discussing in chapter 1 about the founders believing that broad-based property ownership is necessary for a republic to exist. The dots were always being connected back to the founders.
One of the things that also surprised me about ERISA that I found out in your book is that ERISA was first drafted by John F. Kennedy in the United States, carried forward by Nixon, and signed by Ford. So it was completely bipartisan, combination of Democrats and Republicans working together over really 3 administrations to sign it into law. And then I get the feeling that it's been modified a number of times since then.
Yes, various modifications have been made, but the general idea of ERISA was to protect the integrity of retirement plans set up to give American workers income after they retired. ERISA was mainly not set up for employee ownership and profit sharing, but in ERISA, you have deferred profit sharing plans, you have stock bonus plans, and you have employee stock ownership plans, all defined, all protected, and all getting tax incentives from the people of the United States. And why? Because of the belief that ownership and sharing profits was important to a republic.
And a lot of these are set up such that I work for a private company, I'm an employee. They set up a trust that, if I understand it correctly, holds shares that employees can own. Over time, those shares are transferred to me as an employee, potentially. And the idea is that I would hold on to those shares if it's a privately held company all the way until I retire, at which point I would be able to take out the value of my share of the equity in the company.
Yes, exactly. The idea of an ESOP is it's set up to build wealth in the equity ownership of the company until retirement. And if one leaves the company, then one can get the value of one's shares when one leaves or roll it over into an IRA. But yes, the idea is that this wealth accumulation of equity ownership would help finance your retirement.
Now, I can see good things and I can see bad things. I know one of the critiques is, to what extent does my contribution to purchase an ESOP come out of my income? How much risk am I taking in the case of an ESOP?
This is a central issue in American history of employee share ownership, the concept of risk. And I'm so happy that you asked the question. There was a huge expansion of employee ownership plans in the 1920s, just before the 1929 stock market crash. And those plans were based on the workers buying the shares, sometimes at a discount, with their savings and their wages. So when the 1929 stock market crash and the Depression happened, there was a lot of unhappiness about employee ownership plans. One of the great insights of political economist, investment banker, and a lawyer and law professor, Louis Kelso, was that average workers really didn't have the money and the savings to finance having employee share ownership plans. And so he invented the ESOP, and the whole idea of the ESOP is that the companies would finance the employee stock ownership plans, and individual employees would not purchase the shares with their savings or with their wages. That was the big step forward of Kelso's idea, and then it was put as part of ERISA, the major retirement legislation, and that set the stage in 1974 for the massive growth of ESOPs in the US economy. It's true that any equity ownership in any business or corporation carries risk. There's no way around that. And it's true that if an employee is working at a company and they have the risk of losing their job, if they've purchased their equity ownership, they also have a risk of losing their savings or reducing part of their wages.
And is that because if you lose your job and you have equity in the company in an ESOP, that you lose that equity?
Only if the company goes bankrupt.
If the company goes bankrupt, yeah.
So for this reason, there has been the notion by many observers that you shouldn't have equity ownership in a company where you work, especially if you're purchasing that equity ownership with your wages or with your retirement savings. What Louis Kelso's insight was in terms of the ESOP was to reduce that risk significantly by structuring the ESOP so that it would not depend, NOT, on workers buying the shares with their wages or buying the shares with their savings. So it's true. The equity ownership in an ESOP or an employee ownership where the workers don't purchase it with their wages or savings is less risky than if they purchase it with their wages or savings, but it is still risky.
But being in an ESOP and, for instance, having a 401k, and for my international listeners, a 401k is a tax-advantaged way to save for retirement that many employees use. And so a 401k and an ESOP are not mutually exclusive. So you can have both.
Right, you can have both. And what our research finds is that most ESOPs have a separate diversified 401k that has a lot more money in it than the average or the median 401k in the economy. And that also helps reduce that risk profile. We also find through research that has been done with major financial institutions that have financed ESOPs where ESOPs were based on credit to the companies that set them up, that the defaults on those loans have been far lower than the defaults on other kinds of business loans. But the main point that I want to make is the main reason for employee ownership in light of these risk issues is that those who are doing best in the economy are doing best because they have ownership of business assets. And if you're a worker in a company, employee share ownership is your route, the easiest route in this economy, in this institutional setup of the United States to get ownership of business assets. And so I'm not sympathetic to the argument that equity ownership is too risky for the working middle class. Then the working middle class gets knocked back into feudalism, which is how we began this discussion. If all you have is your wages and wage increases are approximately, on average 1 to 3% every year, and inflation is approximately 1 to 8% every year, real wages are going to have you underwater and with no opportunity to accumulate the assets of wealth.
Certainly, if wages don't go down when you join an ESOP, having an ESOP and having some ownership of the company is better than not because it's on top of. And it may include some risk, but A, there's hardly anything that you can invest in that doesn't include some risk. I guess an ESOP is not very diversified, right? Because it's entirely in the company that you're working for. And so, you have to diversify in other ways, but it's still better. And so first of all, I want to talk about how widespread ESOPs, well, not just ESOPs, but other forms of company ownership are in the country. And I will tell you, one of the pieces of data that you had that absolutely had no idea was the case was that 47% of workers have some ownership stake.
Right. Yeah. Let me clarify that a bit more. There's employee share ownership, as in ESOPs. There's profit sharing, and then there's gain sharing, which instead of being based on company profits is based on improvement in company sales or other things. And what we found is that 47% of all adult workers have some form of shares in the US economy. And yes, that is quite surprising. And that also includes employee stock options. But we've recently updated that figure. And I will tell you that It's even more than that. If you look at companies that have stock, that are incorporated as stock corporations, 52% of all the employees in all companies with stock have some form of shares. Employee share ownership, employee stock options, profit sharing, gain sharing, some combination of those. That's quite remarkable. And that's consistent with what the founders wanted, which is they wanted shares of ownership to be ubiquitous in the economy.
And first of all, that was original research that you did that identified the proportion of the working adults that had that proportion. It's exciting. Later on, you're going to say we need more. And so I'm going to want to know why it's not enough. But before we get there, what's the evidence that it's better for companies to do this?
We've done a lot of studies of employees using employee surveys, and the evidence is that employees that have significant employee share ownership and profit sharing say that they intend to stay with their companies and not turn over, especially if that employee ownership is combined with the support of corporate culture, which I'll define later. We did one large study looking at about 35,000 employee surveys. Someone doubted that study and said, well, what about studying, a huge section of companies in the economy? And then we looked at all the companies over several years who applied for Fortune magazine's Great Place to Work contest. And we studied the winners and losers in that contest. Obviously, about 300 or 400 companies apply every year, 100 win, 100 best companies. And what we found, again, is that when you combine employee share ownership and profit sharing with the support of corporate culture, you get significantly reduced expected turnover and actual turnover by employees. So it appears that you can take that to the bank. Recently, in order to deal with further doubters, we got a random sample of manufacturing establishments in the United States. And we compared manufacturing establishments in 2 recent years with ESOPs and without ESOPs. And again, we found that the ESOP companies had significantly more employment stability than the non-ESOP companies, especially when combined with other supportive work practices. And those supportive work practices are increased training, some form of profit sharing or performance sharing on a short-term basis, some form of employee involvement group.
And what was interesting is that one of your studies that you did, you wanted to look at a wide range of companies, and you wanted to look at companies that had some ownership and companies that did not have some employee ownership. But most of the ones that had no employee ownership didn't really want to be involved in the study. And so, if I understood it correctly, you looked across a large swath of companies and looked at how much ownership they allocated and how that correlated to some of the variables that you were talking about, like intent to leave, turnover, things like that. And you found it was even correlated by the proportion of the ownership. Did I get that right?
Yes, significant employee ownership and profit sharing is correlated with both improved productivity and reduced turnover. And I can give you some sense of what the numbers are in terms of ESOPs, just to put some numbers on these things. Overall, in the US economy, the way to think of it is that the average ESOP ownership per worker hovers around $180,000 to $200,000 per worker. But then after about 10 years of being a worker or after the age of 65, that hovers around $350,000. We see many companies where after several decades of being an employee, the ESOP wealth accumulation is close to $1 million or over. So there really is evidence of quite significant wealth accumulation with ESOPs.
It's fantastic. So, ESOPs exist for privately held companies. For publicly held companies, if the employer is giving out stock, are those also considered ESOPs? So, for instance, I've spent my whole life in companies, in my whole career in companies that give stock options or RSUs. And so I've never worked outside of one of those companies, hardly ever. But first of all, I think there's a very different feeling owning stock that's traded on the stock market. And a part of the reason is that it goes up and down without very much relation to what you do as an employee. You kind of feel like it's got its own independent life. And yes, you have influence, but the influence is diluted compared to a privately held company that's an ESOP. And in that case, every success of the company goes directly to something that I have an ownership share in. And so are they both considered ESOPs?
Yes, there are ESOPs in both closely held or privately held companies not traded on public stock markets. And then there are ESOPs in stock market companies. For example, ExxonMobil has an ESOP, Procter & Gamble has an ESOP. And broadly, the way to think of it is this. In closely held companies, a lot of ESOPs, several thousand of the 6,000 ESOPs are majority or 100% ESOPs. And they're often small and medium-sized companies with a few hundred employees. In the public stock market, ExxonMobil, Procter & Gamble, the ESOPs on average represent only about 1 to 3% of total shares outstanding. But because it's 1 to 3% of a much more valuable company, oddly enough, the total wealth accumulation in an ESOP in a closely held company, think of 300 workers in a factory, versus the average wealth accumulation in an ESOP of an ExxonMobil, which only controls 2% of the company's stock, something like that, would also be close to around $200,000 per worker. So you could get wealth accumulation by getting 1 to 3% of a giant publicly traded company or 51 to 100% of a small 300-person factory. There's a role for both in the economy.
Okay, this is something that's harder to measure. And so I don't know if a study has been done. But because we're interested in the experience of work is not entirely financial. And so it's easy to measure a lot of the financial improvements. And that's definitely a part of the experience of work. But I'm wondering if there have been studies done that talk about essentially employee satisfaction and happiness in ESOPs versus other companies.
Right. We find that employees are more satisfied in ESOPs and with employee ownership in general if they have a combination of the economic incentive, the wealth accumulation, and what I call a supportive corporate culture. We've done multiple studies, and it appears that there's several elements of the supportive corporate culture. Job security, the notion that management has communicated to you that you're not going to lose your job. Some form of employee involvement or participation in solving company problems at the job or at department level. Training, more training than other companies in your industry have. And those are really key. Those are really key elements. And as I said, some form of short-term profit sharing or gain sharing, the evidence shows that long-term equity ownership and short-term profit sharing or gain sharing are very much of a sweet spot. And the way to think about the training is that if employees don't have the training and understanding to solve company problems at the department and work level, then they don't have the capacity to improve the value of the company. So training and participation in solving company problems at the work level is really essential.
Now, I have heard in one of the previous interviews that we did with David Ellerman, he said that in Europe, Europeans are often quite surprised to find out that in the United States, there is broader ownership of companies and that this whole instrument exists because the United States is seen as very financially cutthroat and all of these different things. Where does the United States sit? And this is a sort of a compound question. Where does it sit in general? But also, I would have thought that some of the communist countries, when they were privatizing, might have gotten to a halfway point between full privatization and employee ownership. You've done research in that area, so I'd love to explore that too.
The United States at the current time, and we measure this using the General Social Survey, which is sponsored by the National Science Foundation. The United States has about 18% of all adult workers holding some form of equity ownership in the company where they work, and about a third of all workers having some form of cash profit sharing, and about a quarter having some form of gain sharing. Clearly, the United States is the leading country in the industrialized world in terms of having this much employee share ownership. We even have a situation where people believe that executives mainly only receive stock options, where about 8% of all adult workers are holding employee stock options, which is really quite stunning. The only other countries that come close to this are France and the UK. Many people don't realize that President de Gaulle, way back when, pushed very hard for equity participation by workers and profit sharing in the French Republic, and that this has been a long standing practice in Great Britain. But it's hard to come up with comparable figures in terms of the percent of workers in France and the percent of workers in Great Britain. But clearly, the United States, Great Britain, and France lead in the higher incidence of employee share ownership and profit sharing plans.
Now, you were there in Russia when privatization started. What did you expect to happen, and what did happen?
What I expected to happen was that employees in the large and medium companies would have significant ownership. And then, as those companies restructured and did better, the value of those shares would go up. What happened were two things. One is the Russian economy ran into difficult times, and in many of these companies, managers and others bought employee shares from them because employees were running on hard times. The second thing that happened is while the Yeltsin regime initially stressed as part of its privatization program employee share ownership, that was mainly in the lower size of the large firms and the medium firms. There came a point in which the Yeltsin regime made a deal with some of the really huge firms and never introduced broad-based employee ownership into those companies as part of privatization. And this is where you got the oligarchs developed from that. It was called loan for shares. It's hard to get the history of exactly what happened, but it did happen that a lot of really significant oligarchs managed to get control of the largest firms, which you would think similar to the Fortune 100, largest 100 firms ranked by Fortune magazine in the US economy. And so it didn't go in the direction that the Russian liberal economists expected it would go.
Do countries need to reach a certain level of maturity in terms of corporate governance for ESOPs or employee ownership to thrive?
I think so. In my book, looking at the Russian experience, I think that there wasn't enough of a private ownership company culture in place to work with this. Also, as I said, the Yeltsin government tried to introduce this in ultimately what became a severe economic crisis. And so you need to have the introduction of employee share ownership or profit sharing not happen during a severe economic crisis and happen where there's a more developed civic, private ownership culture and corporate governance culture.
At the end of the book, you discuss not exactly policy recommendations, but ways in which the proportion of employee ownership might go forward and do better in the United States. And so, first of all, why does it need to do better? In some ways, it's doing great. If you look internationally, we're doing quite well. On the other hand, there's a lot of room to grow. So it's a question of, do you have policy recommendations? And I'll tell you the question I'm trying to ask, what I want to get to is our democracy threatened by the lack of ownership today? Is what I'm trying to get to. But I was going to ask it in two parts. And the first part was, what are your policy recommendations and why?
My main policy recommendation is that we need tax incentives broadly for broad-based profit sharing, broad-based gain sharing, and broad-based equity ownership by employees. And while we have some of these tax incentives for ESOPs, there are many, many varieties of employee share ownership and profit sharing. We need fairly standard tax incentives for all of them. I do want to say that the one conclusion I came from looking at over 2 centuries of development in American history of employee share ownership and profit sharing is that you got it when tax incentives were made available by the federal government. Most people don't realize that in terms of corporate income tax, the federal government only collects just a few $100 billion in the entire corporate tax collection in the United States. And the United States government forgives about $300 or $400 billion a year in corporate tax collections, and we call that tax incentives or tax expenditures. So we forgive almost as much as we collect. But if you look at tax expenditures, in other words, the dollar value of hundreds of billions of dollars of corporate income taxes that we forgive, they're forgiven to encourage certain behaviors, but very few of those tax incentives go to encourage wealth accumulation through employee ownership by workers. A lot of them encourage all kinds of behaviors that I'm not sure are consistent with giving workers access to owning a piece of the rock. And that's how our tax system needs to be restructured. Now, on your issue about do we have enough ownership to protect democracy? No, I don't think we do. We're at a point right now where the working middle class is hurting. Their real wages, except for the lowest part of the wage group, have gone down. As I said, we've had inflation of 1 to 8% and a wage growth of 1 to 3%. And that ends up becoming reduced real wages. We're not going to see real wages go up to the double digits per year as we saw in many years after World War II. And so workers are going to need an opportunity to have a share of equity ownership or of profits in order to build their wealth. And this is happening while they are under enormous pressure for increased healthcare costs and where they are being asked to shoulder virtually all of the expenses for their own retirement plans.
And if I'm a founder or a private company owner and I'm thinking of retiring, I think of all of the baby boomers in the United States. How hard is it to transfer ownership of my company to employees?
It's not very hard, but there are some barriers. If your company has a good history of sales and profitability and has at least 50 employees, which is the size you need really to kind of set up an ESOP and keep an ESOP going, then it's not very hard. The biggest barrier, however, is that most founders, the mom and pop, have worked their entire lives. Most of their wealth is tied up in the value of the company, except for their home. They would like to get a full check for the value of the company and go and buy their condo in Naples, Florida, and leave some of the money to their children and grandchildren. At present, however, it's very hard for founders to have a bank come forward or a credit institution come forward and finance 100% purchase of their company through an ESOP. Often what happens is the founders find that there's only enough collateral to finance a 40 or 50% purchase. And then the founders finance part of that loan themselves, right? They self-finance the ESOP transaction. Think of it like this. Your company's worth $100,000 and the ESOP can get financing to buy $60,000 of stock of the company because it has collateral to do that, but they can't get financing to buy the other 40,000. And so the founder just has a loan executed between him and her and the ESOP pays it out over the next 5, 6, 10 years. Most founders just want a check for 100% of the company. And so there's some legislation under consideration in Congress right now that's been supported by both Republicans and Democrats to make it easier for government loan guarantees and private capital, together with government loan guarantees, to create the possibility of a deal where a founder from a company that's valued at $100,000 could get $100,000 for the entire company and be able to exit. So it's not that it's not easy, it's that it's not practical enough to get 100% ESOP buyout.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I have a few closing questions that I ask at the end of every show. And they require a little bit of context setting, which is that because we're looking at employees as customers and work as a product, I ask product marketing questions about work. And one of them is, what do you hire your work to do for you? So whoever you work for hires you to do something for them. What do you hire that work to do for you?
I hire my work to make a difference in the lives of my students and to make a difference in the workplace for American citizens in general, because I'm a professor of work. That's basically what I do. I also hire it to support my family, but I don't worry about that because if you have a good job and a good salary, which I have as a professor in a large state university, that pretty much takes care of itself. So I focus more on the impact of my work.
What does your work cost you?
My work costs me emotional labor, but it's more than compensated for by the absolute pleasure and honor of helping individuals and changing the nature of work for citizens in general, and by the experience of working with just excellent colleagues and working in teams and creating something.
What's the nature of the emotional labor?
The nature of the emotional labor is that universities are big bureaucracies, and while I'd rather focus on research and teaching, you have to spend some time focusing on the bureaucracy itself. The other part of the emotional labor is dealing with colleagues, dealing with students, dealing with foundations, and dealing with all individuals is costly, and especially if you want to work into your 80s and 90s. I will be 76, which I want to do. I guess maybe one's patience runs a little thin as you get towards the 80th year.
Where can people learn more about your work?
The best place to learn about my work is to simply Google the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing at Rutgers University. And we have one-page landing page, which has links to all of the work that I've done and most of which I've accomplished in a team with other people here. Our main book, The Citizen Share, published by Yale University Press, is available online and in print. It's going to be revised in the next year. I highly recommend the chapters that we talked about, Chapter 1 and Chapter 4. If you like American history, those may be interesting chapters to you. And then finally, we are constantly updating our research. And if one goes to, again, our main landing page of the Institute, one will see references to new books. And we have something called research briefs, where we give 3- and 4-page summaries of our most recent research products.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed reading The Citizen Share. I didn't expect it to sort of overturn so many of my understandings of history. I don't think I expected it to be a history book. And so, I'm always absolutely fascinated in how the founders were thinking and impressed again by the depth of their thought. It was a great read all the way through.
Well, thank you for taking the time to understand that work and for your excellent questions. I really appreciate spending this hour with you.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.